Hello, my name is Joe. I'm 62 years old, and today I'll tell you my story. I began settling into my seat with a quiet sigh. I've lived a lot of years, but it wasn't until recently that I started living the way I truly wanted. For most of my life, I walked a path that wasn't really mine. You know, the kind, steady job, enough money to get by, doing what others expected of me. But deep down, I always felt like something was missing. It took me 57 years to figure out what that something was: building houses. Not just building them, but restoring old ones, breathing new life into structures that seemed long past their prime. And let me tell you, those last 5 years, they've been the best years of my life. So, if you're up for it, I'll take you through the twists and turns that got me here. It wasn't always easy, but it was worth every step. When I was younger, I never imagined myself as a builder. Back then, life was all about practicality. My parents were hardworking folks, and they raised me to believe in stability. My dad was a factory worker, and my mom did what she could: sewing, cleaning, even babysitting for extra cash. I followed their lead, got a good job right out of school, working in logistics for a shipping company. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. I met my wife, Sarah, early on, and we built a life together. A simple one, but one filled with love. For years, I thought I was content. I'd clock in, clock out, and spend my evenings on the couch, maybe tinkering with little projects in the garage. But there was always this itch. I didn't know what it was at the time, but I'd catch myself daydreaming about those projects. Fixing a chair, building a shelf, patching up some drywall. Those moments of quiet focus, they made me feel alive. Still, life has a way of keeping you busy, doesn't it? We raised 2 kids, paid off the mortgage, and eventually sent them off to college. And just when I thought I might start figuring out what that itch was about, Sarah got sick. Cancer. Joe paused, his voice growing heavier. Losing her was the hardest thing I've ever been through. It broke me in ways I can't fully explain. But it also woke me up. She used to tell me, "Joe, you've got more in you than you let on. Don't waste your time." At first, I didn't understand what she meant. After she was gone, I couldn't stop hearing her words in my head. He leaned back, a faint smile tugging at his lips. One day, about 5 years ago, I saw an old, crumbling house on the edge of town. Most folks would have seen a tear down, but I saw something else, a project. Without thinking twice, I bought it. No plan, no experience, just this feeling that I had to do it. That house saved me. These days, I work for myself. No bosses, no schedules I don't set. It's just me, my projects, and my clients. I take orders directly, word of mouth mostly. And it's been good. Better than good, actually. By the standards of this city, I'm doing pretty well. The thing about building and restoring houses is that it's personal. Every project has a story, and every client has their dreams tied to it. I've worked on old family homes that people want to bring back to life, little cottages folks plan to retire in, and even some ambitious modern builds. Each one feels like a chance to create something that'll stand the test of time. Now, I'd be lying if I said I do it all alone. I've got an assistant, Connor. He's young, probably in his early 20s, full of energy and curiosity. He helps with the heavy lifting and the grunt work, the kind of stuff that's harder on these old bones of mine. Connor reminds me a little of myself when I was younger, except he's got the drive and the courage to pursue what he loves right from the start. I try to teach him what I can, not just about building, but about life, too. He's a good kid, quick to learn, and not afraid to get his hands dirty. Watching him grow and pick up new skills is one of the more rewarding parts of this whole gig. Makes me feel like I'm passing on something worthwhile. Joe paused, rubbing the back of his neck. The best part, though, is knowing that I'm doing something I love. And yeah, it pays well. But the real reward is seeing the look on a client's face when they see their home, their vision, come to life. That's what keeps me going. And now I'll tell you about a situation that happened just about a month ago. It started with a call on my mobile from a couple looking for someone to lay tiles in the bathroom and kitchen of their country house. They explained that they lived in the city for the time being, at least until the house was fully furnished and livable. Seemed like a straightforward enough job, and they were polite folks. I, of course, agreed. Tile work is something I've done plenty of, and I like the precision of it, cutting the pieces just right, making sure everything aligns perfectly. There's a kind of rhythm to it that I enjoy. We scheduled a time for me to visit the property and take a look. The husband, Mr. Carter, said he'd leave me a key under the mat since they wouldn't be around during the week. I didn't think much of it. Plenty of clients trust me to work alone while they're out. Comes with the reputation, I guess. When I got there, it was late morning, the sun just starting to warm up the countryside. Their place was tucked away on a quiet road surrounded by trees. It had that half-finished look, walls painted but no curtains yet, some furniture still wrapped in plastic. A blank canvas waiting for someone to make it a home. Joe leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. But as I walked through the house, getting a feel for the spaces where I'd be working, something didn't sit right. It wasn't anything obvious, just a feeling, like the air was heavier than it should have been. At first I brushed it off. Probably just my imagination, or maybe the isolation getting to me. Little did I know, that house had more than just unfinished renovations waiting for me. I decided to take my young helper, Tommy, along with me for the job. He's a hardworking kid, eager to learn, and strong enough to handle the heavy lifting that I'd rather avoid these days. The house was about a 30-minute drive from the city, nestled in a quiet little village. When we arrived, I unlocked the door with the key left under the mat, just as Mr. Carter said. Sure enough, all the building materials were already there. Tiles neatly stacked, grout and adhesive lined up, and even a brand new tile cutter waiting to be unboxed. It was rare to see clients this prepared, which was a pleasant surprise. "What are we going to do?" he asked, his voice low and full of unease. I didn't have an answer. What could I say? Should I call the police? Should we confront him? My mind raced, but nothing made sense. We were in the middle of nowhere, miles away from the nearest town. And this man, who was he? Why was he standing outside our window in the dead of night? "We're going to stay in here and keep the lights off," I finally said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. But even as I said it, I knew it was a weak plan. We had no idea what this man wanted, or what he was capable of. I moved away from the window, trying to avoid making any more noise. Tommy did the same, though I could see the fear in his eyes. We both huddled together in the dark, listening intently for any sound that might tell us what the hell was going on. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The man didn't move, didn't speak. The silence in the house was suffocating. Finally, I decided to take a risk. Slowly, I approached the window again, careful not to make any noise. To my shock, the man was still standing there, staring. But now something was different. His expression had changed. It wasn't just wild anymore, it was something darker. A grin had spread across his face, thin and twisted. And for the first time, I felt real fear seep into my bones. I backed away from the window, heart pounding, and turned to Tommy. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaky now. "We need to leave. Right now." Tommy didn't hesitate. He looked at me, nodded, and we both moved quickly to gather our things. The fear that had been building inside me was now an overwhelming force, pushing me into action. I grabbed my jacket and the flashlight, knowing that if we stayed any longer, things would only get worse. We crept quietly through the house, trying to make as little noise as possible. The man was still out there. I could feel it, watching us. We reached the front door, but before I could turn the handle, I heard a sound, soft at first, but unmistakable. Footsteps, coming from the back of the house. I froze. Tommy, who had been right behind me, stopped too. His eyes were wide, his hand trembling as he held the flashlight. "What was that?" Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My heart was beating in my throat, and the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up again. We waited in complete silence, listening for any sign of movement. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer, then stopped. I slowly turned my head to the window where the man had been, but he was gone. There was no sign of him outside anymore. For a moment I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe he'd just been a figment of my mind. But the footsteps, they were real. "We can't stay here," I said, my voice tight. "We need to go now, before it's too late." Tommy nodded, and we quietly slipped out the door, stepping into the cool night air. The village was eerily quiet. No lights were on in the houses. No sounds of animals, no rustling of trees, just silence. We made our way to the truck as quickly as we could, constantly looking over our shoulders. I kept the flashlight pointed ahead, my hand gripping the beam so tightly my knuckles were white. I could hear the faint crunch of gravel underfoot, but it seemed like the whole world had gone still, waiting for something. When we finally reached the truck, I wasted no time in getting in. Tommy followed suit, and I started the engine, eager to put distance between us and that house. As I drove away, I kept my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man running after us, or worse, to see him standing by the side of the road, watching us go. But there was nothing, only the dark road behind us, and the headlights cutting through the gloom. It wasn't until we were about halfway back to town that I felt myself starting to breathe again. My hands were still shaking, but at least I knew we were safe for now. I glanced over at Tommy. He was silent, staring straight ahead, clearly just as shaken as I was. "What the hell was that?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I replied, "but I don't think we'll be coming back here anytime soon." It was a strange, unsettling feeling, leaving the place without knowing exactly what we had just encountered. But one thing was clear, I wasn't going back. Not for the job, not for anything. There was something off about that village, something that I couldn't explain. And I didn't want to find out what else might be hiding there in the dark. The drive back to town was long, the silence between Tommy and me growing heavier with every passing mile. The moonlight cast strange shadows over the landscape, making the night feel even darker, more oppressive. I couldn't shake the image of that man's eyes from my mind. Crazy eyes. Eyes that seemed to look right through me. When we finally reached the edge of the village, I turned to Tommy. "I don't know what happened back there," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but it cracked anyway. "But it's not normal. Those people, something's wrong with them." Tommy didn't respond at first. He was staring out the window, his face pale, deep lines of worry etched into his forehead. After a long pause, he muttered, "Yeah, I know. There's something off about that place." I couldn't agree more. The whole town felt like it was holding some kind of dark secret, like it was alive in a way that was far from healthy. I dropped Tommy off at his apartment, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. My body was physically exhausted, but my mind was wide awake, replaying every detail of the night. The footsteps, the man at the window, the tension in the air. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in bed, the covers tossed off me, my eyes wide open as I stared at the ceiling, the quiet hum of the city outside offering no comfort. What had I gotten myself into? Was this all just coincidence? Or was something more sinister going on? The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I had to go back just to make sure that everything was okay, at least that I hadn't imagined what I'd seen. It felt insane, but the idea of leaving that loose end dangling over my head gnawed at me. I called Tommy early, telling him I was going back to the house. He didn't say much, but I could hear the hesitation in his voice. "Are you sure about this, Jim?" he asked. "Maybe we should just forget it." But I couldn't. I had to know if there was an explanation. Maybe it was just a prank, or maybe there was a logical reason for what we saw. I had to find out. I grabbed my tools and headed back to the village that morning. As I drove, the landscape looked different in the daylight. Everything seemed more normal, but the unease still lingered in the pit of my stomach. When I arrived at the house, everything appeared unchanged. The building materials were still stacked neatly in place, and there was no sign of the strange man from the night before. But something still didn't feel right. The air felt thick, like it was holding its breath waiting. I stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath my boots. It looked like nothing had moved since we left. I checked the bathroom where we'd been working, the kitchen, the living room, everything was exactly as we had left it. But then I heard something. It was faint, like a whisper, coming from upstairs. I froze. My heart started pounding in my chest. The sound wasn't the wind or the house settling. It was something else. I swallowed hard and slowly made my way up the stairs, every step creaking under my weight. When I reached the top of the stairs, I noticed the door to one of the bedrooms was ajar. It hadn't been like that before. I pushed it open cautiously, peering inside. There was nothing there. But then I saw it. A single footprint, deep and fresh in the dust on the floor, leading from the window to the bed. I didn't need to check the window. I knew the man had been here. I turned on my heel and left the room, my heart racing. The feeling in the pit of my stomach intensified. Suddenly, I heard the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open behind me. My head snapped around, but there was nothing there. I was done. I grabbed my things and left the house faster than I'd ever moved in my life. I didn't bother to check anything else. I just wanted to get out, to leave the village behind, to forget about the night I'd spent there. As I drove back, the feeling of dread only grew stronger, gnawing at the edges of my mind. There was something I didn't understand about that place, something that wasn't right. I felt like I was in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from, a place where logic and reason didn't seem to matter anymore. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back. And if anyone asked me about that job, I'd tell them to stay far away. Some things just weren't worth the risk. The days that followed were filled with a strange tension that I couldn't shake. I tried to focus on work, on the normal routine of home repairs and renovations. But every time my mind wandered, it would inevitably return to that house. The strange events, the man with the wild eyes, the strange feeling that had been hanging in the air like a storm cloud. It felt like I had narrowly escaped something much darker than I wanted to understand. But it wasn't just the house. The village itself had left an imprint on me. Something was off, and it lingered in the back of my mind like a shadow. I began to second-guess every decision I had made, wondering if I had missed something, if I had overlooked some crucial detail that could explain what had happened that night. Then, one afternoon, I got a call. It was from Tommy. His voice was urgent, almost panicked. "Jim, you won't believe this, but I went back to that house. I thought maybe I was just imagining things, but there's something going on there. I swear it's not normal. I need you to come with me." I didn't need any more convincing. Whatever it was that was haunting me, Tommy had felt it too. Something wasn't right, and I was done pretending it wasn't. We drove back to the village together, both of us on edge. The closer we got, the more my stomach twisted. The village looked the same as it always did, peaceful, quiet, seemingly untouched by whatever strange energy had gripped me the last time I was here. But as we approached the house, things started to feel different. The windows, which had once been clean and clear, now looked grimy, covered in a thin layer of dirt, as if they hadn't been cleaned in years. The front door, which I had left shut, now stood ajar. Tommy and I exchanged nervous glances, but neither of us said a word. We both knew something was wrong. We stepped inside, and the air hit me first. It felt thick, heavy, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. We didn't say anything. We just walked through the rooms, checking everything, but nothing seemed out of place. The dust was undisturbed. The tools were still where we had left them. But there was a palpable sense of unease hanging in the air. Then, in the kitchen, I saw it, a smear of something dark on the floor like dried blood. Tommy stopped dead in his tracks. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. I didn't know what it was, but the answer didn't matter. All I knew was that I had to get out of there. But before I could speak, we heard something upstairs, something heavy moving, footsteps that didn't belong to us. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Is anyone else here?" Tommy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, but it was clear neither of us believed it. We both knew we weren't alone. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer. My muscles tensed, ready to run, but something kept me rooted to the spot. We both crept toward the stairs, the floor creaking underfoot, the house seeming to groan in response. We reached the top of the stairs, the door to the bedroom still ajar, just like the last time. Then we heard a low, guttural laugh. It echoed through the house, vibrating the walls around us. "Who's there?" Tommy shouted, his voice shaking. There was no answer, just the sound of something moving in the dark room beyond the doorway. I couldn't explain it, but something was pulling me toward that room, something deeper than fear, something I couldn't resist. I reached for the doorknob, but Tommy grabbed my arm. "Don't go in there, Jim. We need to leave. Now." But I couldn't. My hand turned the knob, and the door creaked open slowly. Inside, the room was dark, save for a single light flickering from the corner, casting strange, long shadows across the walls. And there, standing in the middle of the room, was the man I had seen before, the one with the wild eyes. His face was twisted in a grotesque grin, and his hands were raised in the air, as if beckoning us forward. We both stood there, paralyzed by fear, unable to move, unable to look away. The air grew colder, and the man's smile seemed to grow wider, more malevolent. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang. We spun around, but there was no one there, just the sound of our own breath, ragged and quick in the dark silence. We ran, and this time, neither of us looked back. We didn't speak a word as we drove out of that village, the house fading behind us. Neither of us could explain what we had seen or heard, but we both knew one thing for sure: we weren't going back. And as we drove away, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever we had encountered there was far from over. It was waiting somewhere just beyond the edges of our understanding, and I feared that one day we would have to face it again. The drive back to the city was silent, the tension still thick between Tommy and me. Neither of us knew how to process what had just happened. The house, the man with the wild eyes, the chilling laugh, and the sinister presence that seemed to grip everything in that place. It all felt like a bad dream, but it was too real. I kept replaying the events in my head, trying to make sense of it. But every time I thought I understood, it only became more confusing. We didn't speak much on the way back, but the silence was heavier than any conversation could have been. Tommy kept glancing at me, and I could see the same unease reflected in his eyes. I didn't need to ask if he felt the same. It was obvious. When we finally arrived at the city, I felt an odd sense of relief. I was back in a place that felt familiar, safe even. But I knew that whatever we had experienced back there was still with me. The darkness of that house, the oppressive air, and the chilling presence of that man seemed to follow me like a shadow. I couldn't escape it. The next few days were a blur. I tried to get back into the routine of work, tiles to lay, walls to paint, but I couldn't focus. My thoughts kept drifting back to that house, to that room, to the man whose eyes burned with something unexplainable. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I was missing, some piece of the puzzle that would explain everything. Then one night I received a call. It was Tommy. His voice was frantic, and I could hear the fear in it. Jim, it's happening again." I went back. I had to see it again, but now there's something else. Something worse. I don't know what to do. It's not just the man anymore. The house, it's changing. I didn't need to hear more. I knew what he meant. That same feeling of dread, the one that had gripped me so strongly before, now had a name. It was something that didn't belong, something that was alive and waiting, something I had only just begun to understand. Without thinking, I grabbed my coat and ran out of the house, not bothering to even say goodbye to anyone. I knew that I couldn't ignore it anymore. The house was calling me back, and this time I had to face whatever it was head-on. By the time I arrived, the sun had long set, and the streets were quiet. The village, which had seemed so peaceful when I first came here, now looked like a place caught in time, like the world outside had forgotten it. I parked my truck near the edge of the village, and as I stepped out, the cold air hit me like a slap to the face. The familiar feeling of unease returned immediately, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man with the wild eyes standing there, watching me from the darkness. But there was no one, just the silence, and the weight of everything I had already experienced. I walked to the house, each step feeling heavier than the last. The door was slightly ajar just like before, and I pushed it open, the creaking of the hinges filling the air. The house felt different now, darker somehow, as if it were alive, breathing in the night air. I stepped inside, calling Tommy's name. No answer. I walked further into the house, the air thick and stifling. The lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Everything seemed familiar, but there was something wrong about it. The room felt colder, the silence more oppressive. Then I heard a low guttural growl. It echoed through the house, coming from somewhere deep inside. I froze. "Tommy?" I called out again, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. I didn't wait for an answer. I moved toward the source of the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. The growl grew louder, deeper, more resonant, until it felt like the very walls were vibrating. And then I saw it, the figure standing in the doorway of the room I had avoided before. The man. His eyes gleamed with that same feral, unearthly intensity. His lips curled back into a smile that made my blood run cold. "You came back," he said, his voice low and raspy, like it hadn't been used in years. I took a step back, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. It was like I was caught in some kind of trance, drawn to him despite every instinct in my body screaming for me to run. "You shouldn't have come back," he whispered. "Now you'll never leave." Before I could respond, something moved behind him. Shadows, dark and shifting, crawling along the walls like they were alive. They stretched and twisted, reaching toward me, toward the door. I turned and ran. I didn't stop. I didn't think. I just ran, my feet pounding against the floor, my heart racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The house seemed to stretch, the hallway growing longer, the door further away, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I had to get out. When I finally burst through the front door, gasping for air, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew something was behind me, chasing me, but I didn't care. I just ran. And as I drove away, the village disappearing in my rearview mirror, I made a promise to myself. I would never return, no matter what. I didn't sleep that night. The adrenaline was still coursing through my veins, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing eyes of the man, the twisted shadows, and the growl that seemed to reverberate in my mind. It was as if the house, the village, were somehow etched into my memory, impossible to erase. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, something that was not finished with me yet. I tried to go about my usual routine, work, meetings, calls with clients, but I was always looking over my shoulder, constantly feeling watched, as if the air itself was thick with something that shouldn't be there. I knew I couldn't ignore it, and I didn't want to either. Tommy's face, pale and terrified, flashed in my mind. He had been part of this nightmare too, and if I let it go now, it would haunt me for the rest of my life. So I decided to do what I should have done earlier. I went to the local authorities. The police were skeptical when I told them about the man and the strange events at the house. They had heard rumors, of course, whispers of strange things happening in the village, strange disappearances, people who'd vanished, but no one had ever come forward with solid proof. They said they'd look into it, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They said it was a small town, full of strange characters and old folklore. They told me the man I had seen was likely just another local eccentric, probably harmless, even if his behavior was unsettling. They made it sound like I had imagined the whole thing, but deep down I knew better. This wasn't just some old man living in a crumbling house. I was about to leave the station, when I got a call from Tommy. His voice was shaky, and there was an urgency in his words. "Jim, you won't believe this, but the house, it's gone. Completely gone. I went back, and there's nothing left." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean it's gone?" "I mean, it's not just abandoned. It's like it was never there. There's nothing but an empty plot of land. No foundation, just dirt and weeds." I stood frozen for a long moment, the words echoing in my head. It couldn't be. I had just been there. It wasn't possible. "What are you saying, Tommy?" "I'm saying it's like the house never existed. But I know what we saw. I know what we felt." I rushed out of the station, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't ignore this. I had to see it with my own eyes. When I got to the village, the air felt different, heavier. The silence that hung over the place was almost suffocating. I parked my truck by the side of the road and walked toward the house, if it was even still there. My stomach twisted with unease. As I approached the site, I could see that Tommy was right. There was nothing there. No house. No foundation. Just an empty lot, like it had been erased from existence. It was as though the very memory of the place had been wiped clean. I turned to Tommy, who stood beside me, his eyes wide with disbelief. He couldn't speak, and neither could I. It was too much. Too unreal. "This doesn't make sense," I whispered. "No," Tommy agreed, his voice barely audible. "But we're not imagining this. We both saw it. Felt it. It was real." We stood there for a long time, unsure of what to do next. The house was gone, but the sense of dread that had filled it still lingered. It felt like something had been taken from us, something we couldn't quite grasp. The man, the shadows, the feeling of being hunted, it was all still with us. "Jim," Tommy said, his voice shaky, "do you think it's really over?" I didn't have an answer for him. I didn't think it was over. I thought about the things I had felt, how the house had seemed alive, how I could still hear the growl echoing in my head. The place had been more than just a house. It had been a doorway, a place where something had been waiting. And now that it was gone, I didn't think whatever it was had simply vanished with it. I nodded, though, because I knew there was no easy answer. There was no way to explain what had happened, and no way to undo it. The house might be gone, but the memory of it, the terror, the twisted man with the wild eyes, the shadows, it would never leave me. We turned and walked away, the village fading behind us. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was we had seen, we hadn't escaped it. It had marked us. And I wasn't sure if that meant it was the end, or if it was only the beginning.